Hi everyone, my name is Robert Veen. Welcome to the Hegel Courses channel, the channel that tries to understand and explain and exposit the philosophy of Hegel, and this year in particular, Hegel's social philosophy. I have to say something now about the whole architecture of Hegel's philosophy, because the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Science um, is not, let's say, the summit of Hegel's thinking. You might think so, because it covers so many topics, but it's not the complete system of Hegel's philosophy. Now, there is a lot of discussion about that, and some people will try to adhere as closely as possible to Hegel's own ideas about the architecture of um, his philosophy. Um, but I'm a pupil of two very great people in Amsterdam, two professors of philosophy. One is called Jan Hollack, Dutch philosopher who wrote a wonderful thesis about Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, and the other is Kees-Jan Brons, who is an expert on the relationship between Hegel and Kant. So these two were my teachers in Amsterdam when I studied philosophy, and they have been my teachers all of my life. So, on the basis of the work of Jan Hollack, I dare to say that Hegel's architecture, the system of philosophy that he presented, looks like this. Basically, you should say that Hegel's philosophy is a philosophy of history. Of course, its method is speculative and dialectic and metaphysical, but the main thing is that he wanted to understand history. And he wanted to understand history as a kind of self revelation of the spirit that moves through history, creates history, produces history, and in which we live and by which or through which we understand ourselves. We are thoroughly historical beings. Now, that is the base of philosophy of history. By the way, Hegel never wrote a complete philosophy of history. He gave lectures on it, but he never wrote a fully systematized philosophy of history. That's one thing. Then we have a book called The Phenomenology of Mind, or The Phenomenology of Spirit, which is actually the way that a thinking human being, any thinking human being, would look back to its own history and reproduce the steps that actually were taken by the spirit or in history in order to produce the current um, position from which to do philosophy. The phenomenology of spirit is about the arrival, so to speak, of our current position. Now, obviously, that meant for Hegel the position at the beginning of the 19th century. So there's a problem here as well. Can we simply presuppose the phenomenology of spirit, or should we make a new attempt to do a philosophy of spirit? Again, when we get to it, we will discuss that further. So that's the second part, phenomenology of spirit, and then based on the philosophy of history. I think the third part of the whole system is the great logic, the great dissertation about method. This great logic, which Hegel published in three different parts, is, I think, the third element of it all. So we have how the spirit comes to itself, phenomenology of mind, how it comes to understand itself, or even tries to understand itself in our current historical position. We have the logic as the great dissertation about the method and the language with which we communicate about reality and by which we understand reality. But on the basis of these both is the philosophy of history that explains to us what it meant to go through the Enlightenment, what it meant to have this long stretch of the Middle Ages in which Christian philosophy flourished. Um, each of these three needs some kind of addition, some kind of addendum, because Hegel wanted his philosophy to be the expression of his own era, which is, let's say, between 1815 and 1830. That's his own era. It's what he called the end of the Christian Germanic principle. He understood that you could only write a philosophy that would reflect on the whole of the previous history if that previous history had come to an end. So he had many statements about this end of the current era in his works. Uh, Logic remained the same to him, but the phenomenology would certainly have to become different. And all the other branches of philosophy, the secondary branches of philosophy, would certainly have to be rewritten, like his social philosophy, the great philosophy of right, the 1821 lectures that we have besides the encyclopedic version, like the philosophy of art, in which he talked many times about the end of modernity. So we must understand that Hegel's philosophy claims to be relevant for his own day and age, but doesn't claim to be a perennial and eternal way of understanding reality that cannot be overcome, that cannot be changed. No, actually, it needs to be changed. That is a consequence of the idea that philosophy is always basically a philosophy, a philosophical understanding of history. What is the Encyclopedia then? I think the Encyclopedia is a book with which Hegel was able to give a sort of overview of all the philosophical disciplines that there are. He talked about history a little bit, but he didn't give a philosophy of history. He talked about history when he talked about the state, because to him, one of the major elements of history is the clash between states, the difference and the communication between different states. And every state, of course, had language and a common people, etc. So it's more than just the state as an instrument of power that he talks about. World history, die Weltgeschichte, is made by states. And of course, the people who lead these states are then the most important people in that perspective. But he only touched on it. He didn't develop the whole notion of history. And that's true for most of the um, things that he dealt with in the Encyclopedia. For instance, the philosophy of art is just a couple of paragraphs, but there is a separate philosophy of art that contains the rest. The philosophy of religion is just a couple of paragraphs in the Encyclopedia. However, it's a separate volume, the philosophy of religion, that Hegel also prepared. So, history is only touched upon in the Encyclopedia, but it doesn't matter because we have these lectures about the philosophy of history that can add to our understanding of it all. From that perspective, if we look at the Encyclopedia as a kind of a overview-like introduction to philosophical sciences, some of these sciences are merely touched upon, like the philosophy of history. Some of them are worked out a little more, like especially the philosophy of nature. When Hegel started out, the philosophy of nature was a very important part of his understanding of the world. So he had many versions of a philosophy of nature. Well, in the Encyclopedia, it's a pretty large portion of his own understanding, of his own systematic thought. But we're going to skip all of that because this is what you need to understand. What we're doing in this course is we start with the social philosophy and we touch upon some of the presuppositions of social philosophy that Hegel had developed in the previous sections of his philosophy of nature, i.e. the anthropology, the philosophical anthropology. We need that in order to understand the category of property. But we're going to start with property later, with just a couple of lectures about his methods, so to get you acquainted with the way Hegel thinks, but then we need to dive into the content of what he was thinking of and what he developed in his philosophy. So let's go to paragraph 1 without much further ado, to just take a little look at the passage itself. So this is it. And let's just read and try to explain every sentence. Philosophy misses an advantage enjoyed by the other sciences. Philosophy is very special in this respect. It cannot presuppose its object, it cannot presuppose anything. It's um, the ultimate answer to the challenge of the Enlightenment, and have the courage to use your own reason, as Kant said. And using your own reason means that you cannot have any kind of presupposition. Maybe you know about René Descartes. René Descartes wanted first in his um, method of philosophy. First, we have to, or in its meditations rather, meditations on the first philosophy, that is to say, meditations on metaphysics. First, we have to destroy all our prejudices. So, what if we take all our prejudices, the things that we are acquainted with, think we are acquainted with, and we put them between brackets, what is later called the Einklammerung, put in between brackets. That is to say, we know that we have these prejudices, but we're not going to make use of them. We're going to shut them out and see if there is something that can withstand our criticism, can withstand our skepticism. And Descartes famously found that there is one truth that we cannot deny, even cannot try to deny, because we run into a contradiction, and that is the truth contained in the statement, I think I am. I think I am. With the act of thinking, some kind of being is also implied. I cannot deny my being if I have to think in order to deny it. A denial is an act of thought. Well, if there is an act of thought, there's also someone who is doing that act of thought, is having that act of thought. No presuppositions. That's the argument uh, of a new kind of philosophy that Descartes made. And Hegel is following that. He's, in that sense, truly a child of the Enlightenment. So philosophy misses this advantage after Descartes because philosophy now has no presuppositions, not in revelation, not in human experience, not in a traditional system of thought. Like in the Middle Ages, Aristotle was seen to be the great doctor of philosophy, and we needed to follow Aristotle in all cases. And before that, it was Plato in the early Middle Ages. No, we cannot have that kind of a presupposition. It cannot, like them, rest the existence of its objects on the natural admissions of consciousness. We cannot say that we understand the world simply by looking at our consciousness and what we think we already know or are conscious of. Nor can it assume that its method of cognition, so the method that we use to understand and know the world, either for starting or for continuing, either for this first step in philosophy or for the continuation of our philosophical reflection, is one already accepted. Something that we can simply rely on and use in philosophy is never a given. There's no foundation for philosophy outside of philosophy itself. Philosophy, in a way, has to start from nothing, from scratch, and it has to build itself up. Now that looks a bit like Baron from Munchausen lifting himself up by the hairs from the swamp. So how is that possible? It's actually a great problem. How can philosophy start without prejudice and without presuppositions? Now, then he makes this statement, the objects of philosophy, it is true, are upon the whole the same as those of religion. I mean, religion has the widest um, um, field of objects possible. Religion deals with everything, everything as it is connected to the absolute, that is to say, the way it is connected to God. Well, if God is the creator of the whole world, and everything in the world has a specific relationship or connection with its creator. So we talk about nature or about logic, about human beings, about history. In religion, there is always a connection to the absolute or God. So the objects of philosophy we already know have to be things like truth and what it means to have a morality, and what's the origin of our values, and um, what is the best way to organize a society. So we share, as philosophers, our objects with religion. In both, the object is truth, the full sense of the word truth, absolute truth, truth in the sense of the perfect expression of what is really there, what is really existing. In that supreme sense, in which God and God only is the truth. So only the absolute, only what I can say from this perspective of the absolute, what can be fully true, what can be 100% reliable, only that can we call truth with a capital T. Both in like manner, so not just dealing with the concept of God, both in like manner go on to treat of the finite worlds of nature and the human mind, with their relation to each other and to their truth in God. Religion does it, theology does it, and therefore also philosophy does it. But philosophy does not presuppose the results of theology. It shares its objects, but not its results. Some acquaintance with its object, therefore, philosophy may and even must presume that, and a certain interest in them to boot, were it for no other reason than this, that in point of time the mind makes. Well, let's stop here for a moment and try to unpack the first part of this.